Moving on, we've got another one of the dromes from the older games. This is Geodrome. Geodrome, sort of like Velocidrome up here, is encountered in the winter ice maps. And overall, it doesn't really behave too much differently. It's the first one of the raptors that has a gimmick. So Geodrome can spit ice and inflict ice blight. Other than that, it's more or less the same raptor fight. So I'm going to put it one tier above Velocidrome. Aside from being a different creature model and ability to spit ice, it is more or less the same. We'll put Geodrome up here. Next up, we've got another Elder Dragon, technically. We've got the final boss of Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. We have Atalka. Atalka looks sort of like this Egyptian praying mantis creature, which is why I always thought it was interesting that it's classified as an Elder Dragon, because it's definitely not a dragon. But, and again, Nikarchos is a squid, and that's considered an Elder Dragon. But you fight Atalka in this sort of desert arena in like a junkyard. And as the fight proceeds, it'll sort of run you over and it'll smack you a bunch. And it'll also use its gold silk thread to pull items out of the ground and hit you with them. It can pull out a big girder-like beam and smack you around the arena. It can pull out a wheel and sort of pull itself around like a transportation type thing. But the most interesting thing about Atalka is after you fight it, it'll go into the second phase where it burrows into the ground. And the lore behind this monster is it's sort of a pack rat. It travels around places collecting junk and different things and storing it in its lair. And when it enters the second phase of the fight, it comes out of the ground using this big, giant mecha dragon. It's very unique to Monster Hunter, and it turns out that what this thing is doing is basically piloting this giant mech robot of junk from the inside using its silk, kind of like a puppet master. And you fight this giant Metal Gear looking destruction creature, and you go break different parts of it, and you knock things down until it breaks, and then it reverts back to the one-on-one fight with just the monster, and then it does it again. Atalka is a really unique fight. It's a unique design, unique fight, and considering the over-the-top nature of Generations and Generations Ultimate, I think it fits in pretty well. So I'm going to put Atalka up here on S tier. Super unique monster. Definitely worth experiencing if you're working towards the end game in Generations Ultimate. It's something you just got to experience. Next up, we have another monster from 4th generation. We have Nurseilla. Nurseilla is part of a unique set of monsters in that it's sort of under the umbrella of the bug family. This one has a unique species classifier. That's right. Nurseilla is considered a Temnoceran monster, which is the sort of classification given to things that resemble spiders. It's got 6 legs instead of 8, but overall Nurseilla looks like a big sort of spider, and it wears the skin of a Gypsyros, I think it is. Yeah, I believe in one of the maps you fight this particular monster, you can actually find its nest where there's a whole bunch of cocooned Gypsyros, which is kind of interesting. It's very unique, and the fight itself is decently challenging. While not a factor here, it's also worth mentioning that the gear, the weapons and armor for Nurseilla are pretty cool looking. I'm going to put Nurseilla up here on A tier. I think I'm going to put it above Chameleos. Would like to see more of the Temnoceran spider monsters come back in later games. There is something that they've shown but not really explained too much from Rise that looks like it's from the same family. I think it's called Yatsukadaki. It's a sort of, I think, pelican spider-like monster, but it reminds me a lot of Nurseilla. So maybe if they're using that skeleton in the next entry in the series, we'll see the original come back. That would be cool. Moving on, we have the subspecies Shrouded Nurseilla. This one looks a little bit different. It sort of has a different patterning to its body. And the skin it wears, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, according to this, instead of a Gypsyros that it's wearing, the Shrouded version has a Kezu skin on it. Which is kind of interesting, the fact that it is wearing this creature's skin instead of this one. As a result, Shrouded Nurseilla inflicts paralysis. The standard version up here is primarily poison. It can put you to sleep with its stinger, but primarily it poisons you. Shrouded will paralyze you if it hits you with its spikes. Pretty neat monster. I would say for a subspecies, it does bring new things to the fight without being too boring. So I'm going to put it down here. Shrouded will go after Desert Celtis. Overall, the bug type monsters I think rate decently high on the list here. It's always something I mention whenever I talk about the next game in the series. I hope they bring back more of the bug types. They're just sort of a good change of pace than fighting your dragons and wyverns and whatnot. Next up, we're going to move on to the Piscine family. And the first one, we have Geodrome. Geodrome is a shark-like creature. You fight it in the desert. It can burrow under the ground and spit water projectiles at you. Overall, it is incredibly annoying. Geodrome, I think, is the first on this list to get an F tier. This monster brings nothing interesting to the table because some of the later ones you find on the list are basically more interesting versions of this. It's a nuisance every time. It's a nuisance when it shows up in fights. It's a nuisance when it's your target. Overall, Geodrome sucks. I don't think anyone's going to fight me on that. Sort of continuing on the trend of somewhat controversial monsters, we have Plesioth. Plesioth is very notorious amongst the Monster Hunter community for those who have been playing the games for a while. This monster is not present in the current generation. The last game I played that had it would have been Generations and Ultimate, but it made its debut a long time ago. Plesioth is a giant fish wyvern. Design-wise, I think it looks really neat. The idea of this sort of fish, shark type creature that's amphibious, it can go on the water and land, is interesting. The problem, and what gives it its notoriety, is its fight. The fight against Plesioth and all its incarnations is not the best. I think in the older games like Freedom Unite, where you only fought it on land, it was probably the worst because this monster had notoriously broken hitboxes. The infamous hip check of doom, where it can hip check you from across the screen because of how busted the hitboxes were. Part of the reason why this monster is so infamous. Later versions of the game sort of fine-tuned it a bit. It actually wasn't bad to fight in the third generation of games in the water. But overall, I wouldn't rate this one highly based on the fight. Its design, I do like. So as a result, while most people would put Plesioth on the F tier, I'm going to put it in low C. I don't think it is overall a better monster than Kezu or Gypsyros or Gravios. I do think it's better than the subspecies, based on design. So I'm going to put it in low C. It's sort of a charity rating because I like its design. I think they could probably improve this monster if they fine-tune its hitboxes and maybe make the fight a bit more dynamic. If they can do that, I think this monster would be fine, and it would sort of outlive this infamous legacy of its past. But yeah, I can't hate this one too much. So I'm going to put Plesioth low C. Its subspecies, Green Plesioth, is just the regular version. It's a different color. Bit stronger, a bit faster, some minor nuance differences in attacks. But overall, Green Plesioth does nothing differently. It's not a different element. It doesn't bring much new to the table. Its design is okay. I like its color patterning. But that doesn't really save this one too much. It doesn't really get a pass for being unique because it's a subspecies. So, Green Plesioth, you're going to go on F tier. You're going to go above Cephadrome because I don't like anything about Cephadrome. But maybe if this one was more different from its regular cousin, but no. I'm not going to rate Green Plesioth very high here. Next up, we got a monster from the older generations. Again, this one might have started in Frontier. I wanted to look that up. Okay. Lavasioth was also introduced in Frontier Season 1. This one was from the same generation as Hypnoc. I think one or both of these monsters resulted in that backlash I mentioned before. But as a Piscine Wyvern, I think Lavasioth's design is good. The idea of a lava fish is pretty unique. The problem is, this thing isn't fun to fight. In the older games, it was somewhat manageable, but still kind of obnoxious. I think the design aspect doesn't outweigh the annoyance of this monster, and that hasn't changed in the current generation. I was glad to see Lavasioth come back in Monster Hunter World, but they didn't really make its fight better. In fact, I think with the emphasis on its lava armor, it made it worse. I didn't have too much trouble my first console playthrough because I used a gun lance, which punches through its armor. But for anyone using a melee weapon, I think Lavasioth is probably just a big pain to fight. So as a result, I'm going to put it in lower C tier. I'm going to put it above Gravios, based on design. Overall, I think that fight needs a bit more fine-tuning and some tweaks. Maybe an overhaul. It's a shame, too, because the Piscine Wyverns are pretty unique. It's just they all tend to follow a trend of either being somewhat boring or annoying. And speaking of Piscine Wyverns, next up is Juratodus. Monster that made its debut in World. Juratodus is very similar to Lavasioth in that it's a sort of mudfish. Its overall body shape is similar, but instead of fighting in a volcanic environment like Lavasioth, you fight Juratodus in the swamps. And it'll swim around through the water, cover itself with mud to sort of buffer against attacks, and it'll spit water blasts at you. Overall, it's a pretty basic early game target. Its design is okay. Its fight is pretty inoffensive to me. So I'm going to put Juratodus. I'm going to put it down here behind Plesioth. I think it's probably tied in this tier because it has a more manageable fight but a less interesting design, and Plesioth has the reverse to me. So I'll put Jura down here. Overall, it's pretty inoffensive. I don't dislike this monster. I don't feel strongly about it. We'll leave you here. Following up on the Piscines, we have Beotodus, which is one of the early game monsters in Iceborne. Logically, if you have a water mudfish, a fire fish, you had to have an ice one. So Beotodus shows up in the Hoarfrost Reach, and it functions a lot like the other fish-type wyverns. It's got a bit more of an aggressive fight to it. It's not a pushover, for one. Even though it's an early game target, it will cause pretty significant damage since you fight it with lower tier gear. It's one of the first things you fight in master rank, and you're usually wearing high rank gear. But it is more interesting in fight and design. So I'm going to put Beotodus up here. I think I'm going to put it above Viper Toby. It does do things different, but I don't think it breaks into the upper tiers as far as memorability goes. Good design, decent fight. In fact, I'm going to put it higher than Kieran, just because its fight doesn't suck. Right now, Beotodus can be the master of C tier.